Have you ever been in an airplane or a car where you felt squeezed for space? Usually the more space we have to move, the better. The same idea applies to chess. The more space we control on the board, the more squares our pieces have to move around, and the less space our opponent's pieces have to use. Notice in this position, white has a massive pawn chain, starting on a2 and moving up the board. b3, c4, d5, e6, f5, g4, and h3. Look at the pawns on d5, e6, and f5. They are already posted on black's side of the board, and with the pawns on c4 and g4, look at all of the squares that these pawns control on black's side of the board. Behind these pawns, white's pieces can freely move around the board. Black's pawns, on the other hand, do not control any space in white's territory, so it is difficult for black's pieces to find active squares to attack white. With white to move, notice how white's rooks are doubled on the g-file, and with the queen on h4, they work together to prepare g5, taking more space on the king side and threatening to open up the g-file with g takes f6 on the next turn, unleashing the powerful doubled rooks on the g-file, pointing directly at black's king. Notice since black's pieces have little room to move around, black's cramped pieces will be no match for white's active forces ready to attack on the king side. In this position, white has two pawns in the center, controlling four important squares on black's side of the board: c5, d5, e5, and f5. Since black does not have any pawns in the center to control central space, white can gain more space while pushing black's developed knights backwards, like this. After e5, white gains space in black's territory and gains a tempo by forcing a developed piece to waste time and move again. Notice black's knight does not have a good square to move to, as e4 is covered by the knight on c3, and d5 is also protected by that knight and white's bishop on c4. Where else could this knight move? After knight g4, since the knight doesn't have any safe squares available, it is trapped after h3. What about knight h5? The knight does not have any safe squares to move to from h5 and is trapped again after g4. Notice that the bishop on c1 controls f4, so the knight cannot escape. This leaves us with knight g8 or knight h7. After knight h7, can you see how white can gain more space and attack another developed piece for black? That's right, d5. White's central pawns push black's developed pieces backwards, so white will enjoy a great space advantage, making it hard for black to develop pieces around these strong pawns on d5 and e5. Let's take a look at one more example together. What should you do when your opponent has a space advantage? Fight back and try to gain space yourself. Look at this position. White has pawns on e4 and d4, just like the last example where black's pieces were pushed backwards. How can black fight back against these space-grabbing pawns? That's right, d5. Black's pawn attacks both the bishop on c4 and white's central pawn on e4. If white retreats the bishop, black will capture white's pawn on e4, breaking up a good part of white's control of the center. And after e takes d5, black has an equal share of the center, and black's light-squared bishop is ready to jump into action on the newly opened h3 to c8 diagonal. Now that you've learned the importance of space, it's your turn to practice fighting for space.